Lord Jesus, give me power. Lord Jesus, give me power. Give me power. Give me power. Lord Jesus, give me power. Lord Jesus, give me power.
In the first service, as Pastor Russ was speaking and introducing me, he said something that just really jumped out at me. I don't even remember exactly what it was, but something about knowing we're not really at home here in this fallen, broken world. Things are not as they were intended to be, as God intended them to be for us. And it made me think immediately about the Israelites, the people of Israel, wandering around the desert for 40 years. I have always felt so sorrowful for the people of Israel and tried to imagine what would that be like, 40 years just round and round and round in the same terrain, desert, outside, exposed, no homeland, knowing it's not where they belong, knowing there was somewhere else that God had already promised to them. And I thought, oh my goodness, that is exactly where we are today. Ever since the price was paid at the cross and the resurrection, we know we are assured of a home that is not full of suffering and sorrow and sickness and pain and loss like this world is. But until we don't have it, we're wandering around in the desert, and it can be very, very painful a lot of times. Until that day when Christ comes back and all is restored. I find myself crying for, Lord, come now, come now. We are longing. How long, O Lord? My first time in Darfur, Sudan, a small group of us Khawajas, which means wealthy white people, because in Sudan, wealthy and white are synonymous. We Khawajas gathered around a gnarled old man, loosely bound in leathered skin that was far too large for his emaciated body. We asked him intimately personal and deeply painful questions about his life in the dead zone of genocide. After several hours of this, we simply ran out of the will to know any more. Our minds reeled, frantically searching for a way to assimilate his story into the context of our Disneyland version of life. And then he pierced our hearts. His leathered lips barely parted as he said, "You have asked me many questions. May I ask you just one?" That seemed fair enough to all of us. Although his body bore witness to both age and abuse, he spoke with the dignity and composure of an Indian chief. "My parents," he said, "were killed because they would not deny Christ. I've lost my brothers, sisters, and children because of this faith. My wife and I alone survive after so many losses, and we're surrounded by orphans who we are powerless to help. I have heard," he carried on, "that the West is filled with many, many Christians, and that you too are a people of faith. So can you tell me, why have your people sat by watching my people suffer under this persecution for more than 6 decades? And now it has spread even to the Muslims in Darfur and the Nuba Mountains, not because of their faith, but simply because of the color of their skin. Yet this is the first time that any of you have ever sat with us or even asked about our suffering." A chilly silence broke through the heat of that day, cooling the arrogance of we Westerners and freezing our questions. I still, all these many years later, shudder with no small dose of grief and godly shame every time I consider all the lost lives of all those wasted years. Why? Why do we sit on the sidelines in padded pews or mega stadium seating, singing hymns and praise choruses, knowing there is a violent kingdom war raging most aggressively against the abandoned orphans just outside our pretty glass windows? Sometimes the way we do Christianity reminds me of the horror movies that I watched when I was a teenager. The scarier the better to me back in those days. I think I love those movies partly because they were an escape from my real-time worries, and partly because something inside of me knew there was a real world out there that was a whole lot darker, more evil and ominous than the self-centered worries that consumed my childish thoughts. One of the most haunting movies that I watched during this period was Dawn of the Dead. If you haven't seen it, I do not recommend it. In this horrible movie, the bodies of the dead could not rest. Instead, just after death occurred, a heinous reanimation took place. The corpse would raise up and roam the earth, tearing life and limb from all who drew breath. It's easy to see that particular evil and the parallel to Satan roaming our earth today. What might not be quite so easy for us to see or willing to look at is how a pervasive response from the church is represented here too. In the movie, instead of combating evil, most people wanted to barricade themselves inside their homes and let the evil roam freely outside, as long as they and their families were safely cloistered inside. At one point, a naive man who had just recently been introduced to the undead cries out, "Why? Why is this evil happening?" Another man, an old veteran at fighting the evil, answered something like this. He said, "Hell is full, so it's spilling over across the earth." Sometimes I feel as though our modern day church builds her theology directly upon these sorts of B-rated horror flicks. We seem to be saying, well, hell is flooding across the earth. Bad things happen. I just pray it doesn't get too close to home. I'll stockpile plenty of food, water, and supplies. I'll push a shiffer robe across my front door to block anything bad from getting in. I won't venture out because it's a dangerous place out there. Now contrast that way of living to the dream Jesus shared for his church in Matthew 16:18. He said, "And now I'm going to tell you who you are, who you really are. You are Peter, a rock. This is the rock on which I will put my church together. A church so expansive with energy that not even the gates of hell will be able to keep it out." Not even the gates of hell will be able to keep us out. Our story, our calling, our very purpose for being here today reminds me of a story Mark Batterson highlights, and it's found tucked in the pages of 2 Samuel chapter 23. I'll read that to you. It says, "And now Benaniah, the son of Jehoiada, was a valiant man of Kabzeel, a doer of great deeds. He struck down 2 powerful men of Moab. He also chased a lion into a pit on a day when snow had fallen, and he killed the lion. And he struck down an Egyptian, a handsome man." I have to say, I really appreciate that Scripture is so graphic and helps us to understand, because I agree, it would be a whole lot harder to kill a handsome man than it would be an ugly one. The Egyptian had a spear in his hand, but Benaiah went down to him with only a staff, and he snatched the spear out of the Egyptian's hand, and he killed him with his own spear. These things did Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, and won a name beside the mighty men of God. He was renowned among the 30, but he did not attain to the 3. And David set him over his bodyguard. Wow. This is our heritage. This is the stock from which we come. Imagine a lion terrorizing an entire village and everyone shutting themselves inside, afraid to even go out to the local well to draw drinking water for their children. But Benaiah steps forward and says, enough of this. And he chases after that lion all the way to the pit where the lion thought by leaping in, Benaiah would be so cornered that he would turn tail and run. But while Benaiah lacked the thick protective hide, the switchblade-like claws for climbing slippery walls and slaying opponents, he had something that the lion didn't count on. He had a love for his God and the people of his God. And he would risk everything, including his very life, to storm that pit and save those people. And Benaiah didn't even rank among the 3 most valiant of David's men who did even greater things. These men are the root from which we sprout. They're the ones who stomp around in our dreams, giving us crazy ideas like flying straight into lawless lands, ravaged by run-amok warlords and snatching orphans straight from the hands of slave raiders, brothel keepers, and genocidal maniacs. They give us dreams that only lion chasers dare to dream. Since my beloved husband, Milton, is an insulin-dependent diabetic and is not able to travel to Sudan, for the first several years, I went to Darfur alone. I worked with our first indigenous leader, James Lualatak. It was there where we had a squat of land on the cusp of the Sahara Desert, but no buildings yet, save one tukul to store food. For weeks or months at a time, I worked in the bush or far up into the desert of Darfur by day and slept under the open stars with hundreds of orphans by night. Those years are both the most beautiful and ominous days and nights of my life. One night I sat up very late because even with the sun long down, my thermometer registered 120 degrees and I just couldn't imagine sleeping. Lualatak had not yet returned from what he called his security rounds. Having no guards and only a thatched fence which goats, dogs, and hyenas were constantly pushing through, it somehow made Lualatak feel better to survey the outer perimeter of our acreage each night before he lay down. Finally, a breeze brazed the desert floor, and I took it as a sign that maybe sleep might magically blow my way. I stretched my sweaty body flat upon my cot, hoping to catch both the breeze and the sleep I prayed it carried. It was one of those black nights where the moon hides itself in some unknown place. The stars were brilliant, but from their high-towered position offered little visual aid without the moon. I prayed and studied their pattern until something like nodding off lulled me into a deeper rest. Just when I was no longer conscious of anything in this world, terrible screams jolted me from my slumber. My first instinct was to clamor for the stick which I kept at my side and often relied upon to chase away hyenas or other wild things that broke through our grass fence during the night. But as I rose, stick in hand, and hoisted high above my head, I heard the scream again. And then I realized I heard no cackling, growling, or tearing of limbs. So it would not be hyenas that I would oppose on this night. As panic threatened to overtake me, I worked to steady myself and discern from where this noise came. The blackness of night pressed in so thickly about me, I couldn't see the stick my own hands held. The troubling noise still came, but it was no longer a scream, more like a distant commotion, a rustling in the wind. I stumbled slowly, turning my head this way and that, like a receiver training my ears to a signal sender. With my stick raised shoulder level now, I ran toward the wrestling, prepared to fight off the unknown maker of noise. Less than halfway through the compound, my feet tangled in the roots of a tree that my eyes couldn't see, and I fell upon my own stick, puncturing my shoulder. Up again, but this time a little smarter, and with my stick a little lower, I charged once more. Only now, I no longer heard the rustling. I stopped, again working to train my ears to catch the sound, seeking direction. Nothing. Cautiously, I headed into the direction that I had last sensed the rustling. The night breeze soothed an abrasion on my cheek from the fall and carried a chilly silence. I walked slowly into the breeze this time, afraid of what my feet would find to stumble upon again. But there was no turning back now. Passing the sprawling mahogany under which Lualatak housed the orphan church, I knew I was approaching the back end of our land. I walked all the way to the dried grass fence, playing my hands across it and seeking a thin patch where goats or wilder beasts had broken through before. I found one, pulled the opposing sides apart, and squeezed my body through the opening. Scanning left and right, my eyes caught a flicker of light straight ahead. Earlier, I'd given Lualatak my headlamp to make his security rounds. He was the only one I knew who had any sort of torch. It must be Lualatak, I told myself. A glimmer of hope rose within me, and I moved toward the light. Long-legged, Lualatak covered his ground much more quickly than me, and we met just shy of the center of the land that stretched between us. Without speaking a word, we read the well-matched dread in one another's eyes by the light of my headlamp, which Lualatak now held in his hands. Both our faces winced at the same time as our ears trained in on the whimper. I hooked my arm in the crook of his as we ran toward the painful sounds, just a few yards away now. In the dim light of my torch on that moonless night, I thought my eyes must be playing tricks on me. Shredded piles of rags don't bleat and groan, but then the pile moved, just a hair, and I knew it was a child. I knelt down in the dirt beside her, carefully peeling back enough of the bloody cloth clinging to her broken body to find her head. If I'd seen the child in our village before, I couldn't recognize her now with all the lacerations pocking her face. Her little body lay twisted on the desert floor, and her right arm, judging from the angle at which it protruded, had to be broken. Lualatak stood over me, wailing, "No, God! Not another little one! You must stop this, God. I really mean it this time. You must stop this. Where are you, God?" Lualatak wailed. He couldn't even bring himself to touch the broken child. I worked futilely to limit the pain that I inflicted upon her as I pulled her into the nook of my lap. With the small child cradled in my arms, Lualatak helped me to stand, and he put his arms around me, steadying me as we walked back to my cot. I had no medical training to interpret what I saw, but from the way that her tiny legs splayed, I feared our little angel's hips had been broken during the brutal rape. Lualatak brought me a bucket of dirty water from the well, the best he could find, and I did the best that I could do to gently wash our little angel as she passed in and out of consciousness. It wasn't until the next morning that I saw the large chunk torn from her outer thigh. That explained why she was out so late to begin with. She had probably been forced out to find food or water some days before and had been bitten by some sort of wild beast and then was unable to make it home. Unless, of course, she was an unadoptable orphan who had no home to return to anyway. I gave Angel some broad-spectrum antibiotics that I had tucked away in my backpack. Lualatak went to the commissioner seeking vengeance for the rape and begging for help to find a vaccine for the rabies we feared she had contracted from the bite. Sudanese-style vengeance came quickly to the Muslim man believed to have committed the rape. the cry for rabies vaccine fell flat upon the deaf ears of a blind world. Angel's fever soared to 106, and in the days to follow, she died. I can't really say from what, but I can say why. The why is because she lived in a lawless land of poverty, slavery, and genocide, which too much of the world doesn't even want to consider. But we, beloved brothers and sisters, we are from the root of lion chasers who are called to leap into the pit and slay the beast that preys upon innocent children. Sometimes the beasts we chase are malaria, dysentery, cholera, kala-azar, rabies, and meningitis. Other times they're too young pregnancies, rape traumas, slave raiders, hyenas, or two-legged beasts who will tear them apart as surely as any feral thing. These are beasts that we can defeat. But make no mistake, this is war, kingdom war, and a victory will not come without valiant men and women jumping into the pit and wielding their spears against our singular adversary, the one orchestrating all the beasts we chase. In this very room, God has provided through you not just one spear, but at least three. In your first hand, He has given you the spear of training and education. Proverbs 25:2 says, "It is the glory of God to conceal things, but the glory of kings is to search them out." God has granted you the glory of kings through the gifts of books, the internet, and formal education. Honed well, these tools provide miraculous insight into many of the mysteries hidden behind the veil of evil we lift. Used well, our education is a ferocious weapon against the beast we face. In our second hand, we hold the no less powerful spear of humble service, the willingness to learn from the wisdom and holiness that suffering has given to those whom we go to serve. Witnessing, honoring, simply sitting with, submitting to, and learning from the wealth of the Sudanese suffering experience of loss, pain, and darkness will make us mighty, transformed warriors indeed. This is what Harvard psychologist Kathy Weingarten calls compassionate witnessing. And it is very foreign to our Western models of missiology, where we view and even have the audacity to name ourselves as planters of ministries and churches in impoverished nations. It would serve the kingdom far more richly if we viewed and named ourselves something more like cupbearers, willing to come up under Christians of impoverished nations as God plants in and through them directly. How dare we ever think we are the planters just because someone is poor? They're poor, not stupid. Finally, there is the spear which we cannot cling to, carry, or wield, but that only has power when we lay it down. And that is the spear of our financial resources. Just as God has given you the glory of kings, He has also given you the treasure of kings. He calls us, equips us, and expects us to chase the lion all the way to the very gates of hell and carry on in this same spirit of insane obedience until either there are no more orphans sleeping in trees, barely escaping slave raiders, warlords, and genocidal maniacs, or until He returns, forever locking the gates of hell, ending It's bleeding over the earth. After Lualatak and I buried our little angel, we sat in the loose, rocky soil, side by side, just crying and talking a while. Finally, he asked me the same heavy question I'd heard him scream when we first found our little angel. "Mama Kimberly," he said, "where is God?" I shared with him the secret that keeps me going when I'm tempted to give way to discouragement and fall into despair. I said, "Lualatak, that reminds me of what Mother Teresa once said to a reporter when he sarcastically asked her, 'Where is your God when a child dies from hunger in the streets of Calcutta?' Mother Teresa said, 'God is with her. The question is, where are you?' James, I said, God is here, and you are here with the children. We just need others to pick up their spears and wield them in the battle with you. So what can you do? How can you wield your spear? I hope you have a pen and paper, because I'm about to tell you how you, right here in this room, can wield your spears. Number one, dare to get informed. Dare to know what is happening outside of your pretty world. You can sign up for our free newsletter right outside on a table. We're going to give you lots of information, not only about Sudan, but human trafficking. We'll link you to government sources. We will link you to secular sources. And we will link you to Christian sources. You will be well informed. We will tell you true, real, live stories as they happen and what you can do about it. Or you can go directly to makewaypartners.org and sign up electronically. Study our blog and website and read Passport Through Darkness, the book that I wrote a few years ago. I think that we're out of copies here. We used them all in the first service, but we can get more, or you can download it through Amazon or Kindle, your favorite electronic source. 100% of every dollar that comes from Passport Through Darkness today, or as you download these, goes directly to help the children, to save the children. We do not take any administrative fee for any of this. The one thing that I want you to know is that Make Way Partners is not, Passport Through Darkness is not a missions book. It's not even a book about human trafficking. It is chiefly a book about how God transformed my life from my version of a dream for my life and showed me his version of his dream for my life and for the kingdom. Many who've read it tell me that Passport Through Darkness has helped them to find God's dream for their lives in the kingdom as well. Number two, you can become a Make Way Partners volunteer, representative, or speaker, an orphans ambassador right here in Canada. Help us spread the story. Most people simply don't know what's happening to the orphans in our world, but once they know, they respond. Help us share the story. Give away the book. Give away the free newsletters. Number three, in the meantime, you can literally save a life today by sponsoring an unadoptable orphan like Peter Ding or William Atak that you'll see on the screen. Many people don't know what unadoptable means. It shocks us. We think, well, if we just adopt orphans, but the point is that there are 80% of the world's orphans today are legally unadoptable, whether that's because of war, which is a big one, or U.S. sanctions or Western country sanctions against the corrupt governments, whether it's trafficking by the governments themselves. There are many reasons that render a child unadoptable. We have to begin grappling with what we do, how we live out James 1:27 when adoption is not an option. How do we care for these children in their own country? One way that you can do this is through complete sponsorship. Help us build the homes, build the schools, build the clinics, everything that it takes to raise a child. It's important for you to know that Make Way Partners takes zero administrative fee from our child sponsorship program. Every penny that you give to care for your child goes to buying their food, their clothing, their housing, their education, their spiritual formation. You're literally raising a child. Even with 3 different orphanages in our network spanning North Sudan, where there are bombs still being dropped daily, and South Sudan, where the war is still raging, we literally have hundreds of children begging at our gates every single morning. Please let us in. Our answer right now, we have 1,100 orphans under our complete care program. And at this moment, we have to say, I'm sorry, little one, but there is no more room in the inn. You can make a far-fetched dream come true for these precious orphans because it only takes $75,000 to build a safe and loving home for 30 orphans. Imagine saving 30 orphans all at once. For that same amount, you can build a medical clinic. Find a group of friends, a Sunday school class, co-workers, a book club even. Find a group of friends to raise that money and go into a home building business that's always successful, no matter the economy. While it may feel overwhelming to think of 153 million orphans in our world today, remember that there are 2.1 billion Christians sharing this earth with those children. If every Christian family committed to provide complete care for just one orphan, together we could save them all. It is possible. We have the power to write the rest of the story for millions of orphans, to choose the fate of my little angel or Peter and William, one child at a time. First through our personal support, and then by sharing the story so that more of those 2.1 billion Christians will know, and they too will have the power to save another and another and another.